because this might be the inner chronicle of what we are, and we have to articulate ourselves, otherwise we would be cows in a field.
Welcome to Cows in the Field. This is a show in which we discuss philosophical themes in popular films. My name is Justin. Hey, folks, it's Justin from the future. So I forgot to record Laura on this episode. And so she was there, but none of what she said was recorded. And I apologize for that. So just know that some of this episode has been edited a little bit to take out some bits where we were conversing more with Laura. And for that, I apologize. But I still think it's a really great episode. And Matt Strohl has a lot of really interesting views about this movie. So do stick around to hear that. All right, back to the show. And today our movie is Richard Kelly's Weird and Wild, The Box.
Mrs. Lewis, I assume you received the box.
I'd have an offer to make. If you push the button, two things will happen. First, someone somewhere in the world whom you don't know will die. Second, you will receive a payment of $1 million. You have 24 hours.
And we also today have a returning guest, Matt Strohl. Matt is a professor of philosophy at the University of Montana and the author of Why It's Okay to Love Bad Movies. Welcome back to the show, Matt.
I'm thrilled to be here.
We're very happy to have you. And, we had you on for Twilight, which was, it turned out, a very influential movie for the two of us. I assigned it in philosophy of film. We're watching it next week for that and talking about your book. So thank you for changing our lives, Matt.
That makes me very happy.
So, okay, we start with a quick background on this film, okay? And here's basically the preamble. So I'm not going to tell you what happens in the film, but I'm just going to give you a sense of how this film is set up. So it's based on a short story by this guy, Richard Matheson, who apparently he published a bunch of short stories that became films like I Am Legend and others. It inspired, as you were thinking, Laura, a Twilight Zone episode. Yep. And it tells the story of a young couple, Norma and Arthur Lewis, who are financially strapped and given an unusual out. A man, Arlington Stewart, appears on their doorstep with a box. If they press the button on the box, one person they don't know will die, but they will receive $1 million in cash. And this sets in motion a strange and wonderful series of events that takes us through Sartre, Mars, aliens, teletransportation, conspiracies, religious faith, morality, and finally, the things we might sacrifice for our family's good. All right, Matt, so you suggested to us The Box, Richard Kelly's The Box, the last film he has made, and that was in 2009. Tell us about your relationship to this film. Why do you love it? How did you come to love it? And where you stand with it now?
Oh, yeah. So The Box, it was released when I was in grad school. And at the time, a lot of my friends there, in particular, my buddy Dave Baker, who's a philosophy professor at Michigan now, were big fans of Richard Kelly's Donnie Darko, which I was a detractor of because when it came out, everybody's like, oh, this is like the new David Lynch type thing. And I was like, kind of like, I was like, maybe if you're not that into David Lynch, you would think that, it was like my attitude. And like, I just was kind of shrugged at it. I thought it was just sort of not all that interesting. But then, so it was very popular and that earned him a lot of goodwill. And then he released this incredibly audacious movie, Southland Tales. And even though, like, at the time, I can't say that I loved Southland Tales. I think it's grown on me over the years. But at the time, I just couldn't help but admire that audacity. And also, he wrote Domino by Tony Scott, which is an incredible film that I loved very much when I first saw it. So I'm like, this guy's actually pretty interesting. So when The Box came out, I was really curious to see, like, what else is this guy capable of? And the first time I watched that movie, I mean, now I've seen it enough times that I understand the narrative is about as well as one could, I think, I hope. But the first time you saw it, it's just wild. It's like, what the hell is going on in this movie? These like cubes of water and people teleporting and all this like body snatcher stuff. And I was just really blown away by it. I found it really exhilarating, like how the experience of watching the movie and how surprising it was and how bold and refreshing it was. And I ended up like doing complete 180 as a result. I went back and I watched Donnie Darko, watched the director's cut, which I think is much superior because there's a lot more world building. And I just did a complete 180 and I'm like, all right, I was wrong. Donnie Darko is good. And everybody who for years had been arguing with me about this was like, it was a major victory for them, right? And to this day, I'm still harvesting the good faith that earned me, right? Because to this day, some of those friends are like, hey, if Matt can admit he was wrong about Donnie Darko, then I can admit that I was wrong about, De Palma's Femme Fatale or whatever movie. So anyway, so for me, it was like, not only did I love it, but it actually led me to become what I would consider a Richard Kelly fan. So part of the reason I picked this movie is that to talk about with you is that it put him in jail. I mean, he's still not making films, as you said. And it's like, I think one thing that could return this guy's career, if he's interested in that, is a major public reappraisal of the box. And I'm here to say, let's get the ball rolling. Like, it's time. It's time for everybody to revisit the box and realize that it's really great.
Yeah, let's do it right here, right now. Let's do it. Richard Kelly, if you're listening, we're here to defend the box. We're here to get all the 4 critics that listen to this podcast to write think pieces on the box here and now. I do have a slight nitpick about the setup of this. But then maybe we should talk a little bit about, what happens in this movie, because it is very strange, as Matt pointed out. My nitpick is this. The way that, I'm going to just jump ahead briefly. What we learn is that Arlington Stewart works for some aliens, some supreme beings that control lightning, and they're testing humans. Basically altruism, I guess. And the box is a test to see if like we're worthy of these aliens keeping alive or something. But the thing is
I think it's that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think it's that what it is that because we've reached Mars, so now all of a sudden humans are like a threat for space exploration, like, right? Or because we reached the moon and we're on our way to Mars. The idea is that because we're now potentially capable of visiting the rest of the galaxy, now the aliens are concerned, well, how altruistic are they, right? Because they might need to be exterminated if they're potentially hostile.
I see. Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, good. So that's potentially the reason they're testing us. But I think their test is a little funky. So, I mean, for one, just one thing is the idea that it's this kind of generic altruism that one person you don't know will die. Now, this allows for the humans to confabulate, and they do, in fact, and I think rightfully so, to say, well, maybe this was someone that was already going to die. I mean, if it's somebody on their deathbed, I'd rather that person die and I get $1 million. They're going to die anyway. I'd rather take that $1 million. But if it's a young person, then maybe I don't. But then again, I don't know them, and so I don't bear any, relation to them. It's also unclear. He doesn't make it super clear that they're pushing the button will cause the death of these other people. In fact, you might think if the way it works is you push the button and then he's like, great, I got to go kill someone else. You might think, well, he doesn't have to do that. Maybe he could just be a nice guy and not kill that other person and give me my $1 million. So, you might worry that you're not actually that causally responsible because he still chooses to do it. And then the other problem I have is that, in fact, it turns out actually none of that is true. What actually happens is the person who's given the box prior to you is if as long as they made this choice, is then given a new ultimatum whereby a loved one of theirs is going to suffer to some extent. We'll talk about the details in a second, unless the husband or the wife kills the spouse who pushed the button. And so it's actually that person's choice, which is the thing that is killing the person whom you, the box button pusher, are being held allegedly responsible for. But you are not responsible for that. That was their choice. And then that was also the choice of Arlington Stewart to put them in that situation. So it turns out you're actually not responsible. You should just push the button then. I mean, I guess if you knew you were then going to be subjected to that choice, you shouldn't. But you're not actually causing the death of anyone. That's a lie.
Well, so look, so I think what you're highlighting here is that the sort of simple, obvious surface interpretation, which is this is what the test is. The test is, will you press the button and take the $1 million or not? That's what they're interested in. And then the rest of this, whatever. That interpretation can't be right, right? So I think like the question then becomes, what is the test, right? I don't think that we should believe that that's the test. And I don't think that we should believe that when he tells her someone you don't know will die, that the person who actually dies at the moment she presses the button is that person. So my theory is that the person that she doesn't know who will die is herself, right? That the notion is that the person you don't know yourself, who you will come to know through the next few days, that person will die if you press the button. That's my theory.
That's really interesting. That's a little tricky wordplay, though, because
did you read the short story?
No.
Okay, so in the short story, it's like 5 pages long. It's really short. So in the short story, okay, it's much simpler, right? So the proposition is someone you don't know will die. You get $50,000, but this is pre-inflation. And the woman is very greedy. She's like, I want to spend the money on blah blah blah. And then she's also very racist. She's like, what if the person who dies is in China? I don't care, right? Whereas her husband is like, we don't need that money. I don't care about that. I'm happy to just be with you. And she presses the button and her husband dies. And then the guy comes and says, I thought it would be somebody. She says, I thought it would be somebody who I didn't know who would die. And the guy says, do you really think you knew your husband? Right. So in the story, it's like a monkey paw thing where there's a twist on the meaning of the deal to begin with.
Yeah.
So I think that there's another twist here. And I think it's open to interpretation. I think the notion that it's herself as the person who she's killing, that's just one possibility. I think there are several other possibilities that are the movie leaves in play, but I think the key is that we can't take the deal literally. It's like a monkey paw thing, right? It's like, and I think that when you think about the narrative of the movie, so them pressing the button and someone dying is just the beginning of it, and then there's this very, very elaborate series of events that leads up to the dilemma that you mentioned at the end, where it's like either your son will be deaf and blind, or else you'll have to kill your wife, right? So like, why would they do all that if all they cared about was whether you press the button or not, as far as how altruistic are you, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the movie's demanding that we sort of that we ask that question of like, what is the test and what is actually happening? Because I don't think we can take that surface explanation.
I like that a lot. I think though that, are you thinking though, Matt, that the explanation that Stewart delivers on behalf of his alien friends is basically like, we're just testing like altruism just to kind of see if like the human race is altruistic enough to like keep around. But my issue is that the test they give them isn't a good diagnosis of that. Even understood in the monkey paw way we've given, which is actually kind of, I never thought about that. So that's really great. I like that. I like that narratively. I think it's really cool. But I don't think that's even a good test for altruism. I don't know. But anyway, Matt, you seem to think there's more going on than just what he says in that moment. So I'm curious, like, what else is the test
I mean, again,
revealing?
I think you're right. So like the way they try to make the decision about whether or not to press the button is to determine whether it's real or not. And if it's not real, they're more likely to press the button. But in that case, like, why would you press the button if it's not real, right? So I think what's interesting is the way that they need to lie to themselves in order to press the button, right? They need to like self-deceive about their own moral character in order to press the button. And like the way that the husband reacts when he finds out that it's real is like, no, I want to undo this, right? But he's not so against it when he's not sure if it's real. Right. So there's something very interesting about that. So again, like, and I think that when you try to evaluate, like, how are the aliens testing us for altruism, but that's what they're doing, the test has to include the second part as well. And I think what's super interesting, it's like, so two possible interpretations, right? So what ends up happening again is the husband gets a dilemma, or the couple gets a dilemma. Either the husband shoots the wife in the heart, or the son is deaf and blind for the rest of his life, and they get to keep the money, right? And so you might think like, oh, here's another chance for altruism, but there's no reason to think of that as altruism, right? And indeed, so I was just watching the movie again, and one thing that stuck out to me, right? So the series of events that leads them to that moment where he shoots her, right? It's crucial that when he shoots her, they believe that there's an afterlife. That's part of why he does it, right? So, and the thing is, why do they believe there's an afterlife? Well, because they were both summoned to the library where they both had these experiences that led them to believe this, right? But how did they get summoned to the library, right? How did they get summoned to the library? So they were both given call signs by employees. So remember, this woman, this like hysterical woman, hands her this thing that says this is a call number at the library, and her nose is bleeding. But we know that means she doesn't have free will. That means she's doing the alien's bidding. So the first time you watch the movie, perhaps you think, oh, this woman is like rebelling against the aliens and like using her free will to slip her a hint. But really, this is the aliens manipulating her to the library so that she'll have this experience that will lead them to make this final decision, right? And so when they make that decision, there's a way in which what they're like expressing the opposite of altruism. It's like, I can only, I can only do this if I believe nothing bad will happen, and like for the sake of someone in my own family who I have like a direct personal connection with, right? So you might think, again, like that the test about altruism has as much to do with that, like their ability to do that, as it does with the initial decision to press the button.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And but here's one thing that on that read, I think in some ways they do pass the test in the first instance. So the fact that they have to lie to themselves about whether it's real or not before they can push it does suggest they have some altruistic tendency in them that they have to overcome. And the fact that he tries to give the money back is, I think, similarly, like he tries to undo the thing when it seems like it's real, is actually a suggestion that there is an altruistic tendency. And so maybe, weirdly, on that read, they have passed the test at that stage. And you know, I mean, I don't know. If I was like the alien at that point, I might think, oh, that's actually a good sign. So, yeah, Matt, what were you thinking? I found the no exit thing inexplicable. I didn't totally get why it was there.
Right. So interestingly, I think this is really hard. So I definitely have some open questions about this. So she's initially introduces it, like she's teaching it to like high school kids, right? She emphasizes this idea that hell is being seen by others for who you really are, right? And then after she presses the button, they're taunted with this like no exit is written on her car by one of the employees, right? Now, my initial thought there, right, is that remember, in order to press the button, they have to maintain this delusion that like they're good people and they're only doing it because they don't think somebody will really get hurt, right? But of course, they do want the $1 million. They just like maybe nobody will get hurt, or maybe it's just somebody would just die anyways, right? But so the thing is that now they're being revealed as who they were. She's like, their characters revealed as who they really are, namely people that would push the button, right? So the idea is, and I think that the fact that so you get this, again, body snatchers effect, where like the people who are possessed by the aliens look directly into the camera and nobody else does. So you know somebody's possessed because they look directly at the camera, or because their nose bleeds, right? Are the two signs. And so, but the thing is, like all of them look at once, like their gaze is all controlled by the central board consciousness, right? And so you have this like being seen as who you really are, right? So in Sartre, right, there's this idea that the person who's like a voyeur is like looking through the keyhole, watching somebody change, let's say, and then they're suddenly horrified by the idea of someone walking in behind them and seeing them doing this, right? So it's like this sort of idea of being apprehended by the other is at the root of this moral shame. And so like in the film, then again, that like they're just surrounded by people, like anyone around them could be someone who knows what they did, right? And I think that that's the no exit connection, right? Now, but we also have to think of it, because remember, there's this afterlife emphasis at the end of the film, and there's this idea that there's also a possibility of eternal damnation, right? So like he's given the choice, he's like, pick one of the 3 doors, 2 of them lead to eternal damnation, 1 leads to paradise or whatever. And so we have to, I think, connect that with no exit, which I haven't really gotten that far, right? As far as like, how does no exit help to illuminate the end of the film?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this. Okay, so two thoughts on that. So on the being seen thing. So James Marsden's character, he says at one point, "This is a prank. It's just it's a gift for the engagement party they're going to, the rehearsal dinner party, and then like everyone will have to like raise their hand to say whether they push the button or not, right? And that's what's
Right.
going to happen, which is interesting because that suggests he's already thinking in terms of who's gonna. How are they going to think of us if we are like seen as these people who would push the button? And interestingly, I think Norma pushes the button right after that. Like she's sort of like undeterred by that, which is kind of interesting. The second thing is I think there is this notion in the No Exit play that they talk about it's hell as other people, so it's supposed to be hell in some sense, but it's also they talk about it as purgatory. And so you can sort of think about like, I mean, purgatory is this strange concept, which is like, it's kind of like an extension of life. Like life in some sense is purgatory. If you think of it in the Catholic way, where it's like this waiting room where you kind of do enough good deeds and you go to heaven or you're decided to go to hell. So it's kind of like life is just purgatory. But that, you're then faced with these moral choices, which you make in purgatory. And then depending on whether you choose well or not, you're then afforded salvation or damnation. And so maybe that's another connection. I mean, I thought it was interesting that in the case of the three water things, that they're indistinguishable. So like in the case of choosing to push the button or not, it's not indistinguishable. I mean, roughly what the consequences are going to be. But in the case of choosing which of these cubes to enter, it's a coin toss. I don't know.
That's why I think that they're being manipulated. I don't think you could take what the aliens are telling them at face value, right? So I think that there was no other outcome except that he was going to be teleported back to his bedroom, right? And that the whole point of this again was to like lead them into this final decision. So and again, I think there's multiple ways to take this, but it's like part of me wants to say that it's the fatalistic realization of what they brought about when they pressed the button. Again, she's causing herself to die, and so I think that the big interpretive question of the film is, again, what are the aliens really up to? Because we can't take anything they say at face value, right? There's sort of, and I think this is why people react so negatively to the film. But to come back to that point that it was poorly received, right? Is that like in sci-fi? I think what we're often used to are either the characters somehow theorizing about things out loud, so we have some explanation of how they work. Or else with everything being explained to us, it's like a lot of like most film sci-fi is very exposition heavy, I think, right? Especially like high concept stuff like this. I mean, there's obviously things like 2001, but I think that a lot of high concept alien encounter stuff very explained. And part of what's interesting about the film is that I think that Clarke's third law comes up a lot, that suitably advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and I think that it lets it be magic for us, right? So in other words, it lets the aliens, again, never just explains anything to us, and we have to piece everything together. And ultimately, it's all magic. In other words, ultimately, like we don't understand what they're up to, what they want, or how they did any of this.
Yeah,
right?
I like that. I like that a lot. And one of the themes that I took from the film this time around, and I think the first time actually too, I think that was the thing I wrote about in my Letterboxd review the first time I saw it, was that I think it's a movie about a secular person trying to grapple with religious faith, like what it would be to have religious faith, and in particular the kind of religious faith which requires of you that you do that kind of leap of faith where there's something which is unintelligible to you. It makes absolutely no sense, and it's the scariest thing to confront this thing and to sort of submit to it, to just be like, well, this thing is more powerful than me. It's a supreme entity, and it's asking me to do these things which make no sense to me, and I just have to go along with it because I have to like submit to its will in that sense. And in that way, the film seems to me a little bit of a piece with movies like Knowing and The Killing of a Sacred Deer, and to a certain extent, like those like Lovecraftian horror films like The Color Out of Space more recently, and Annihilation as well. These films which like sort of have people confronting the horror of the inexplicable. So anyway, that was the way I was thinking of the film, and that I think dovetails with the things you were saying, Matt.
Yeah, or like another sort of very obvious point of reference would be Knock at the Cabin, right? If you saw that, I mean, it's literally it's almost the same thing. It's like,
Yeah.
will you kill your loved one as a gesture of faith, right? And then also Signs, right? Similarly,
Yeah.
So I think Shyamalan big time, but yeah, totally. So like, and you mentioned so before we started recording, you mentioned that this is partly autobiographical for Richard Kelly, right? His parent, like, so the two characters are modeled after his actual parents.
So apparently, yeah, his parents, he grew up in what seems to be a secular household. I mean, his dad was a scientist. His mom was a teacher. It looks like she was teaching, well, I don't know, philosophy or something. She's teaching at some elite high school, so potentially philosophy or literature. And yeah, and apparently, I mean, those little details, like the fact that the mom character, Cameron Diaz, has this disfigurement, with her foot that was a result of an X-ray malfunction. That, I guess, was real. That really happened to his mom. His dad really worked on the Mars, the optics for the Mars rover and all that. And so that is like, these little details. There has to be a reason why he's inserting them into this movie, which otherwise doesn't really need them. And to a certain extent, like the whole, it's all a red herring that there's this connection between these guys, that Arlington Stewart was one of the scientists that was connected to the Mars team that Arthur was working on, and so on. Like, that's all a red herring, but it kind of sets up this conspiracy almost. So it's kind of fun that it makes it seem like there's this greater conspiracy happening that has to get ferreted out. And there's even some scenes that are thrown into the movie that really make no sense from the first viewing, where you suddenly are watching some other guy on the phone, and then he's being photographed, and you're like, what is happening? And it really does suggest that conspiracy paranoia thing. But I think, like, all that is just a red herring. And I think it's really interesting that he's just like, all right, I'm going to use my own autobiographical details and like turn them into these red herrings because they feel so specific that they have to mean something. And really, maybe they just mean something to Richard Kelly.
So something that's a little bit confounding about the movie, I think, before they're even offered the deal, right? So before they're even offered $1 million to press the button on the box, they're set up for it by a couple of the employees. So one of the first things that happens in the movie is one of the kids in her class teases her about her foot, like very cruelly, like, sort of asks her to show her disfigured foot to the whole class, and is very cruel to her about it. And that kid, we quickly learn, is under the control of the aliens.
Yeah.
So that's them setting her up for the deal. But the other thing that happens is that the principal of the school, her boss, tells her that, like, we're getting rid of the tuition break for faculty. So they're gonna have to pay more for her kid to go to school, right? And and his nose starts bleeding. So that's also being done by the aliens, right? Right. And then at the same time, it's like the husband saying, like, oh, we need money for the surgery. So, like, I think the aliens are trying to, like, sort of amplify their distress.
We've canceled the faculty tuition discount.
Starting when?
Next semester. I'm real sorry about this, Norma.
I know you are. Your nose is bleeding.
Yeah, so one interpretation you might have of this, like, way that they're set up for the test is that, like, oh, well, maybe when people have self-pity and people have their own problems, they're less altruistic, and the aliens want to prod that. But another possibility is maybe that, like, they're less capable of faith or something like that, right? Because when they press the button, not just out of greed, but out of a lack of faith that it's real, right? We discussed. Whereas the final decision of the film to, like, for him to shoot his wife in the chest is a gesture of faith, right? So, like, perhaps, like, the major emotion is not from selfishness to altruism, but from, like, a lack of faith to faith, or possibly from a lack of freedom to freedom. Right? We should talk about that the other possibility, which I'm just introducing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Although it is interesting that the leap of faith that they make is one that is totally grounded in at least some evidence, because they've been given all this evidence by these creatures. So it's not a total leap of faith, although of course it is still ultimately a leap of faith in the sense that they don't know for sure whether there's an afterlife, but they have had a mystical experience. And that's, that's more than nothing. But I do, say more a bit, Matt, about what you were talking about it being like an exercise of freedom. So you're thinking that in the early case where they are denying the reality of the box, that's a kind of unfree behavior. They're sort of acting when they push the button in a kind of unfree way. But then when Arthur kills Norma at the end, that is a kind of true free action. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, so what leads me to that thought, again, I'm like, so a lot of the things I'm saying might be in conflict with because I do think it's a really difficult film. So I'm kind of throwing out a lot of ideas here. But there's this Sartre quote that we get. We get an explicit Sartre quote, which is, there are two ways to enter the final chamber, free or not free. The choice is yours.
Yeah.
So the film is basically, I think, demanding that we understand the ending in terms of that quote, right? Free or not free, the choice is yours. Well, so in Sartre, right, there's facticity and transcendence, right? So there's like the facts about who you are already and what your life has been and what you've done, and then there's also transcendence, like what you can become, right? And there's two forms of bad faith: denying your facticity or denying your transcendence. So in other words, like the person who says, I'm not a thief, I'm going to change right now, is that they can delete their whole history of thievery, right? Is the person who denies their facticity. And then the person who denies their transcendence is the person who says, I can't help but steal, I'm just a thief, that's who I am, right? So like freedom is in apprehending both at once. So like, just again, like I haven't worked all this out, but my interpretive thought here is then that like somehow or other, they're in denial at the first phase, right? And then at the second phase, perhaps, right, there's this maybe not, like they achieve this final condition of, acting freely, and that's how they enter the quote final chamber. But again, like I'm not sure if that's right. It might be the opposite of that. It might be they don't act freely in the end, right? But I think that the film is asking us this question at least, right? Like, at what point do they enter the final chamber free or not free, right? Yeah. Do they do that?
I mean, it totally, part of it does feel like Kierkegaard's reading of the story of Abraham, but other parts of it don't. I mean, because in this, I'll explain. So in the story of Abraham, God tells Abraham is to kill his son. This is like the son he's prayed for years, and then God finally gave it to him, and then God's like, by the way, you need to sacrifice your son. And so Abraham goes up and like is about to plunge the knife into Isaac, and God intervenes at the last second. And Kierkegaard thinks this is like the ultimate expression of faith, because that is like, you're willing to even do something which is by your lights immoral. You're willing to do it because it's commanded. But the thing I think is interesting is, so you might think that's the same as what happens with Arthur, because he's told you have to kill your wife. Like, this is what you have to do. But it's slightly different, because presumably he has very good evidence that his son really is in a disabled state, and as a result of the fact that these creatures seem to be able to, a steward is able to put his son into that state, is good evidence that he has the power to take him out of that state. And so what the bargain he's given him is genuine. And so then it's not quite the same, because with the Abraham Isaac thing, it's not really a moral dilemma. You shouldn't do it. And Kierkegaard concedes you should not. He actually morally should not do it. But that's why it's such a powerful act of faith that he does it anyway. He's willing to do it anyway.
Yeah, no. Well, I think though, I mean, you're focusing on his decision to kill his wife. I'm focusing on her decision to die, right? So like the way, again, like the what I'm inclined towards, my suspicion here, my interpretive hunch, right, is that that there's this sort of crucial implication of the no exit material, right, is that like she's going to be known for who she really is. And then I want to say that she's going to be known to herself for who she really is ultimately, right? And that again, so when she presses the button, the person who's going to die is herself, and she doesn't even know that person yet. So the idea that she somehow achieves, so somehow the motion from pressing the button to deciding to die, she achieves some kind of self-knowledge, which I want to link to the idea of freedom and also to faith.
Interesting.
Right. So like, and again, like becoming aware of herself as a free being, like, apprehending her facticity and transcendence at once, something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And admitting that she's the kind of person who pressed the button and therefore this is now what she has to do. Right. So there's like sort of all this self-reclaiming in that gesture.
That's really interesting. And to build on your interpretation, she makes the choice to die before Arthur actually and he actually requires the rationalization about, well, there's an afterlife, I saw it and all that, to actually pull the trigger, but she doesn't seem to need that. She's just willing.
And she might not even believe that. That might just be what he needs to believe to go through with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so that she's now, it's like for the first time acting freely, right? Is the idea. Whereas when she's sort of, when her own self-pity, let's say, is controlling her actions, when she presses the button originally, she's not free. Right. She's like, she's just an automaton at that point. And now she's acting freely in this gesture of self-sacrifice, something along those lines.
One other thing about that, this is her journey. And I was focusing on Arthur because I was thinking of it in terms of the act of killing. And I was like, that's analogous to the Abraham thing. But one other reason to think that it's the journey is really hers is that she dies and sort of achieves this transcendence, perhaps by choosing freely to die. And he, at least I will speculate in this moment, ends up becoming one of the thralls. Like he's just going to go and be like Gillian Jacobs, who's now going to have to go to the next, they're going to Massachusetts or whatever, and he's just going to be possessed or whatever by this hive mind. And he will truly be unfree in that regard because he's just going to be a vessel. And so it's not really his journey in any sense. His journey just ends in hell, basically.
Right. Well, one little detail that it's easy to lose track of, right, is remember that when the Borg woman gives her the call number that sends her to the library, she says, "Don't trust anyone, not even your husband." And then when she sees her husband at the library, she hides from him.
Yeah.
Right. So we don't know if she ever starts trusting him again. We don't actually know that, right? Or we don't know if she's just selfishly, or sorry, not selfishly, but if she's just trying to save her kid and is manipulating her husband into that outcome. We have no idea because there's no, we know that at some point she doesn't trust him, and then we don't know, there's no point where we see her regain her trust. That doesn't happen.
That's interesting. Okay, that's interesting because that could potentially give her a motivation to not continue her life with her husband and her now blind and deaf son. Because, that's the alternative that she's facing is we all get to be together, except our son is going to have this impairment. And you might think if she now feels alienated from her husband because she can't trust him or whatever, she's looking at that's a bad deal, right? She'd rather not be alive and her son be whole. And now knowing that her son will not be with her husband because he's going to go to jail, presumably, for this action. And so she's thinking, actually, that's the best. The best outcome might be me and my son are together, but that's not on the table. So, but then I don't know how that fits with the reading though, because you want this to be somehow. I don't know if that is an act of free choice. It does feel like it could be an explainable action in the sense that it makes sense given her interests.
Well, the husband doesn't go to jail, right? They arrest him. Then they uncuff him, and the NSA leads him away. And the NSA are working with the aliens.
Yeah,
right?
no, that's why. That's why I think he becomes a thrall, right? He becomes one of the Borg people or whatever.
Right. So, one interpretive possibility that's on the table then is that she thinks that so that's so she's thinking already my husband's one of them. Right. And so what she needs to do, and again, so you're right, that the only reason that he goes through with it is that she says to him, he smiled at me. Does he smile at her? I don't even know if he, right. So it could essentially her only loyalty could be to her son at that point. And she's just trying to get through this situation, to get him to do it, to actualize the prophecy. she could just be making that up because that's the only thing she has to go on. Like that's the only confirmation that there's an afterlife.
Yeah.
But that's the only way that he's willing to pull the trigger. So he's not acting freely, in other words, right? You could imagine. It's like you have to get him to do it only by making him think it's the way to preserve his family. And note, so when the conditions for the test, it's only happily married people, right, that are being tested. That's one of the conditions. It's happily married, under 40, one child, right? So
damn it, that's us.
Yeah. Right. Like the test is predicated on the idea that he's only going to do this. He's going to pull the trigger because he believes it's the only way to have his family united, right? But maybe like she knows she doesn't believe that. She just believes this is the only way to get him to like enable her self-sacrifice. So she's acting freely, but he's acting his actions determined by like this is the only way to get the one thing I can't live without, my family.
We cannot leave him like this. It's the only way. There's no other way. There's no. He smiled at us.
What?
When you asked him about the afterlife, he smiled at us.
He did, didn't he?
Arthur, I love you, and I am so sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to us.
You didn't do anything. We did it. So don't apologize.
I mean, again, so now we can offer like a sort of metafictional reading here, right? Which is like, so again, Clarke's third law, suitably advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And then we can apply that same principle to the narrative, right? So like this sort of suitably advanced sci-fi is indistinguishable from fantasy or whatever, right? But like this sort of the way the movie withholds on all these mysteries, it like says something, I think, about like the artistic gesture of the filmmaker, right? So in other words, like, you know, part of what I didn't like about Donnie Darko in a certain way the first time I saw it was a sense that it was too neat, that it came together. Like, but then the director's cut kind of unsettled that when I saw that. Like, oh no, this is super messy, actually. I like that. Right. And so like, I mean, I wonder if there's a sense in which the like ultimate indeterminacy of the narrative suggests something, a gesture from Richard Kelly about his own sort of artistic point of view.
What I mean is the idea that, so we had been exploring the idea that he is, you know, identifying with the perspective of the child, Walter, but now we're suggesting he's identifying with the perspective of the alien, who's scripting these elaborate things, but to what end? I mean, I take it that like the alien, you know, I mean, we could take the alien at face value and that this is some like test for humanity, in which case on that read, Richard Kelly has given us an aesthetic test to pass. Like you gotta like this movie and get into it, or like, you know, you haven't passed the test, or is it like supposed, you know, or is what else? If we don't take the aliens at face value, then I don't know what their aim is. And so then are we supposed to think like Richard Kelly has these inscrutable aesthetic aims and we have to like confront the fact that he has some sort of fiction making god, you know, is inevitably going to be inscrutable, and like we have to like submit to his will or something. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out like which of these on the metafictional read like comes out most flattering.
Well,
to
I was
Richard
going to
Kelly.
suggest something more along the line. So it's like restaging your own childhood again, like the Fableman style reading. So like, you know, like you might think that there's something about how like, you know, like, so two possibilities. First possibility for a metafictional reading, something like, you know, restaging your childhood, like you maybe there's some like this idea that you can't reach the kind of satisfaction and determinacy and like legibility of self-understanding and like tying your, you know, something like that is a possibility. But there's also the idea though that like the film, like if too much were explained, if like the film answered all its questions for us, it would become so much less interesting, right? Like look at the conversation we're having, right? So like I want to say something like, you know, there's like a gesture about sci-fi, right? Which is again like, isn't it even more fascinating if it doesn't tell you everything works, right? And isn't the film so it's not so much like I am an inscrutable god. It's more it's so there's a character in the movie says at one point, I like Mr. I think it's actually Arlington Stewart, but I might be wrong about that. But so they're talking about the idea of mystery, and one of the characters says, I like mystery, right? And that's, you could think that that's Richard Kelly, especially if it's Arlington Stewart and right? It's Richard Kelly saying like, I like mystery. I like that this film doesn't answer every question for you. I like that it leaves you something to think about and talk about and puzzle over.
Yeah, so he's
right?
like sort of like, hey, I'm giving you a gift.
Yeah.
Some little mystery
box
puzzle
you can
box.
press the button or not.
Yeah, it's a puzzle over. Just like Arlington Stewart is giving these poor people a gift, namely of like puzzling through these moral dilemmas and trying to figure out what the fuck is going on with their lives and what they're being subjected to by these torturing aliens and so on. That's interesting. I do like that. Reed, I do think there's like, it's like slightly dissonant with what the like aliens are in fact doing. Cause like you might think if the aliens were really trying to like spice up these people's lives, it wouldn't end in death. It would end in like, isn't this interesting? Like there's some things that just are unresolved. But it does feel like but that's why this is, as you yourself put it, this reading is intention a little bit with the sort of self-understanding, actualization, freedom, reclaiming reading of Norma's narrative, because there it does feel like, well, maybe she's embracing the mystery, so to speak, but it does feel like there is a kind of resolution, at least to her arc.
Yeah, so you could say then that like, he's trying to sort of restage his childhood and perhaps like give his mother this sort of gift of this representation, right? But there's also a sense of a ultimate lack of resolution as well, right? At the same time, like, that the sort of like,
well, we don't know how it ends for her. I mean, we know she dies, but we don't know if like this is ultimately, I mean, I guess that's the end. I mean, really, it's the end of her story. So there's lots of still loose ends. They just don't really concern her. They concern what happens to humanity. They concern what happens to Arthur and Walter. Anyway, that would be my thinking in terms of, her, because it's not really she's not interested in going to heaven. At least, right? So her story is done. She does this one final act of freedom, and that's it.
Well, something super interesting that we haven't mentioned. Was so the husband's gift to her of the like prosthetic foot thing, right? So it's like he makes her at work. He designs and invents for her this like insert so that she can wear shoes comfortably and walk around. And the interesting thing is, they're like all the things that she wants to get out of the money, she actually gets it out of that gift, which he was already going to give her before she pressed the button.
That is interesting.
Right. So it's like when we see her like dressed for this party, she feels sure of herself. She can walk without a limp. Right. So it's sort of interesting that like, like I want to suggest that the great irony is, right, that she does in a sense die content because she's gotten this gift from her husband, and that's the knowledge perhaps that she gains about herself, right, is something like, like I never really needed the money. I didn't know myself until later, right?
I think that's totally right. I mean, it sets up like, oh, they really need this money, but also they live in a fucking nice house, and he drives a Corvette, and whatever, it's fine. You could sell that Corvette. Anyway.
But they think that these things will make them happy.
Exactly.
That this is what they think will make them happy, or like all possessions and so on.
Hey guys, again, Justin from the future here. So at this point, Matt was going to say something cool, but it's again responding to something Laura said. So basically at this point, Laura has asked Matt to talk about how this is a Christmas movie. Okay, back to the show.
Yes, I was looking forward to this. I was really looking forward to this. It is, first of all, it is a Christmas movie. Let's be clear about that. We've even got Santa Claus.
It's your favorite
right?
movie.
And what's interesting though, like, so really notably, I think, when we see that, so a woman presses the button at the end of the movie as she dies, right? So like we're repeating the pattern again, right? Which means that, like, so there's a heavy emphasis on Christmas in that shot, right? She's like, she's surrounded by Christmas ornaments and so on. And like, I think there's a sense there of like, the linking of Christmas and like material greed, right? And like, so what's the classic Christmas theme is learning the true meaning of Christmas, right? And you might think that that's the motion that they make is from like the materialistic greed of pressing the button to like at the end where they understand the true meaning of Christmas, which is like family and belonging, right? Which is what they already had before they pressed the button.
Yeah, and that they've now lost.
Yeah, exactly.
At the result of
Well, maybe they don't lose it though. Again, like maybe they finally gain it through this gesture of self-sacrifice.
Right, but then they are ultimately going to be separated, and so, well, I mean, what they gain, Matt. I mean, I think we need to. I just want to emphasize my view on this is there may be some gain in that moment, a gain of an instance of freedom, but then they're separated, and that in some sense. That is a loss, right? I mean, I think we have to concede that there is some loss after they're now not going to be able to be together.
If only she had not pressed the button.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like
shouldn't have pressed. Yeah. I mean, once you press the button, though, this is the best case scenario, right?
Yes, that's right.
In other words, so like the materialistic possibility, the possibility where they don't learn the true meaning of Christmas is the one where they live out their lives and spend the money.
Yeah.
Right. So like the point is that I take it that like this gesture of freedom and self-sacrifice is somehow like a more authentic gesture of love towards her family than to like, live things out with all the money and so on.
Well, I think we can all agree that it's a weird ass film. And and it's a wonderful weird ass film. And I just wanted to mention two other things that I thought were just aesthetically striking. One is the cinematography. So he's got diffusion filters on everything. So everything's glowing. Every light source is glowing and hazy. And there's, it has this kind of, very natural unsharpness compared to like the stuff we see now where everything is hyper sharp because of the digital cameras. And then the other thing is the score, which I didn't realize until I saw the credits is made by Arcade Fire. And I really liked the score, and I got to put it on my score list now to listen to while I'm working. And I just thought it was I'm not sure exactly how to even describe it, but it has kind of classic themes in it, like classic kind of old Hollywood themes, but then it also has this kind of sort of droney mystical dimension to it as well. And I think it kind of captures the two sides of like this, this kind of like modern sort of sci-fi thing, but then also hearkening back to a kind of an older age.
And then just the choice of like soundtrack music, right? So you've got the Grateful Dead in there. Scarlet Begonias is played on the dance floor. You got Led Zeppelin, and then you got a Scott Walker tune, like the "When Joanna Loved Me" bit,
Yeah.
And like that's all. A lot of that stuff is like psychedelic coded, right? Like Grateful Dead, obviously, but Scott Walker. This is, I think, psychedelia. And so that, like, again, I'm back to this magic quote, right? I think that there's like definitely like the surrealism of the film, the weirdness of it, I think is at some level, and the score as well has like a kind of psychedelic thread running through it.
I like that. That's cool. Oh, and you mentioned the you brought back to the Arthur C. Clarke quote, and Matt, I think you had some knowledge about that painting that
right.
appears on
there. So like there's a painting we see twice, right? It's the quote is with the painting, right, on a
like a poster or something,
in their basement,
right? Yeah.
Right? And then when he's at the library, right? Like when he's at the library before he goes in to choose one of the three cubes, we see the painting again. Okay. Yeah, so the painting is significant now. So the painting is by Edward Austin Abbey, and it's part of a series of paintings on King Arthur. And this particular painting is of Galahad, approaching the seat perilous. So what the idea is that this is a seat at the round table, that anyone who sits in it, who except for the one who's pure of heart, who will get the Holy Grail, anyone else who sits in it will die. Right. So it's a painting of Sir Galahad approaching to come sit in the seat perilous. And that actually works out. Right. So given that we see this right before the husband goes through and chooses the door number 2, right? There's some suggestion that he's being compared with Galahad, right? But maybe that's just like the way he needs to think of himself, right? Like so he's he's the NASA guy. He's the one who has this poster. So he wants to think of himself as the one who could venture forth into the universe, right? But maybe it's like really it's his wife, right? I don't know.
I mean, in some ways, we can think about what, in that moment when he goes to choose the 3 cubes, 2 lead to eternal damnation. What was the other one? The other one leads to mysteries of the universe.
The light, right? And it's like,
and
even they tell her go towards the light, like yeah.
And although we do see like maybe he goes into some sort of like light thing, he does end up in damnation. I mean, he is damned in the end, and maybe he was already damned by the fact that this has all been put in motion. But so to your point, Matt, that he imagines himself as Galahad, perilously walking towards the seat or whatever. It's not going to work out for him. He's actually going to sit down thinking he's Galahad, and it's not. He's not going to be.
Yeah, that's definitely a live possibility. I like that. Right? It's a very dark, cynical reading, which I like. And again, maybe she's Galahad, maybe no one is. Right? Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap up. I mean, Matt, tell us. So you wrote this book, Why It's Okay to Love Bad Movies, which is an excellent book. Everyone should read it. It's out in Routledge. What are you working on now? Like, what's coming down the pipeline?
Okay, well, I got one book that's drafted that I will be revising, and we're hoping to get it out by the end of the year. It might be early next year, which is called Hard to Watch. Right now, the tentative subtitle is How to Fall in Love with Difficult Movies. And it's a book. It's very much a sequel to Why It's Okay to Love Bad Movies, right? So whereas Why It's Okay to Love Bad Movies is about like what bad movies can add to your life, like just getting into bad movies, what that can do for you. And this is sort of about like getting deeper into difficult movies and sort of escalating your relationship with cinema, what that can do for your life, but also like how to do that. And and so some sort of topics like like how to use film, like what is film criticism supposed to do for you, and like how to benefit from engaging with film criticism, and like what to think about movies that bore you, and how to engage with the movie even as you find it boring, things like that. So it's very much like the other side of the coin. It's like so if the first book is It's Okay to Eat Your Dessert, this is but also eat your fucking vegetables sequel, right? And then after that, I'm looking to write another book about low culture trash. That's in the pipe.
Cool.
Lifetime movies, I promise, will be in the book 3.
Christ, Matt. That Sight and Sound poll got released at the perfect time for you.
I got like 8,000 words on Gene Dealman in this book. I eat, slept, and breathed Gene Dealman for a solid month, and I have been sitting on my hands. Like people have been talking Gene Dealman, arguing Gene Dealman for months. I got this whole massive take I'm ready to unroll, but I'm sitting on my hands because it's in the book.
Well, we look forward to reading it. Matt, thanks so much for being here. And you are at Strohltopia. STROHL on Twitter. Where else are you? Strohltopia.com?
I'm at Strohltopia, STROHL on Twitter, and then I'm Matt Strohl, you just find me under Matt Strohl on Letterboxd. I think I'm Matt Strohl 99, and then my blog is Strohltopia.com. I haven't been updating that as much as I used to. I'd hope to get back to it when I'm in between books here, but I at least post on that 2-3 times a year at least.
Awesome. Yeah, check Matt out on all those places. We are at CowsPod on Twitter. You can find us on the web at cowspod.wordpress.com and buy a shirt with 2 cows on it at cowspod.threadless.com. And in 2 weeks, we'll be talking to Phil Iskov of Podcast Like It's 1992 about the 2002 Soderbergh remake of Solaris. So we'll see you then. Bye.